Welcome to this episode of LSTM In Conversation podcast. This week's guest is a globally respected expert in malaria and also a global health leader with over 30 years of experience working across Africa. He's an LSTM alum, having completed his diploma in tropical medicine back in 1981, and his research career started at the UK Medical Research Council in the Gambia, and then where he later established the KEMRI Wellcome Research Programme in Kenya. So his work is focused on malaria immunity, but also pathogenesis. And one of the areas he's been particularly interested in is building that African-led research capacity. He's advised WHO on malaria. He's chaired the WHO Malaria Policy Advisory Committee, and he's also supervised more than 40 African research leaders. Our guest has been an advisor to the African Academy of Science, a founding director of the Science for Africa Foundation, and also co-director of the Africa Oxford Initiative. His contributions have been recognized with major international honors, including the Prince Mahidol Prize and the Al Samate Prize for Development in Africa. So I'm really pleased to welcome this week's guest, Kevin Marsh. Kevin, you've worked at the forefront of malaria research and global health for over 3 decades. What initially inspired your focus on malaria, and also what really drives your long-term commitment to research?
Basically, attended a series of lectures by Ian McGregor, who was the doyen of British malariology. And although it seems kind of one of these made-up stories, after the second lecture, I just knew what I wanted to do, and that was to understand malarial immunology. And that set the course of my career from then onwards. Of course, I ended up, sort of not only doing immunology, but getting involved with pretty much everything to do with malaria. That really set the course of my career. That's sort of doing the DTMH in Liverpool and going to that series of lectures.
And what happened in between? What was it that really put you at the forefront of the research? What made you the scientific leader that you are now?
A number of things. I think one thing I'm always really aware of is the kindness of other people, because at that stage, I spoke to Ian McGregor, and he said, "Oh, you need to speak to Brian Greenwood in the Gambia." Brian was at that time director of the MRC unit in the Gambia, and of course, this was in well before even emails, and the only way to talk to him was to put in a long distance telephone call booked to the Gambia. And he didn't know me from anybody. I just said, "Look, I'm a young doctor in Liverpool. I'd like to come and work on malaria with you." And he said, "Well, I'm over in the UK shortly. Let's meet up." And we did that. And it sort of all went from there. At the same time, Brian said, "Oh, yeah, if you're going to do this, you really need to talk to Lou Miller, who was in the laboratory for parasitic diseases at NIH." And I did the same thing with Lou. I rang him up out of the blue on a long distance call, introduced myself. And he said, "Yep, great. Well, if you're going to go to the Gambia, get in touch and come over and spend some time in our lab." Then when I arrived at NIH, Lou kind of met me at the airport, and every morning came in and gave me a sort of seminar on all the work in his lab. And thinking back since then, I've thought, both were incredibly busy guys, and yet they sort of, without needing too much detail, just decided that the update would really be as helpful as they possibly could.
And I think related to that, one of your defining legacies is the fact that you've built scientific leadership in Africa, and that's through programs like the KEMRI Wellcome program, also through the Science for Africa Foundation. So what do you think of the lessons and the challenges that you've learned and that people can apply in developing what are sustainable and, importantly, locally led research ecosystems?
If there's one thing that any building up of scientific capacity or any sort of capacity is long term, and maybe may sound so obvious to say, but it is critical in terms of planning it and funding it, is that if you look at someone's scientific career, on average, I guess, the time you finish your first degree, you go to go through subsequent degrees, do research training, so on and so forth. I guess it's on average 20 years plus that you're training before you reach a point where you have really, if you like, substantial influence. I don't mean, of course, that sort of midway through your career you can do great stuff and big impact, but in terms of the point at which you're able to sort of have a strong influence on international policy, at the same time affect other people's careers, it's a very long training. So I think if you don't take that into account, it's really hard to do anything substantial. So I think long-term view is the biggest thing. The other things are, of course, things like building critical mass. You can't do anything on your own, and you do need critical mass, not just in terms of infrastructure, but intellectual critical mass. And then I think the key things are the quality of collaborations and interactions with people as things build up. In my case, I guess it was quite strange because we were originally working in a part of Kenya which was fairly isolated and did not have a strong scientific kind of, if you like, ecosystem. So it was rather odd because attracting people to come there was hard at the beginning. But I think what was really important is to make sure that the whole thing is co-created, that it's not sort of just an idea that one says, let's do this and it's great and we'll organize it all and everything. I think it's really important that the way you do these things is very carefully co-created from the beginning. So taking into account those things, the fact it's got to be long-term, you do need to build a critical mass, and it's got to be genuinely led by partnerships. I think, to me, they've been the really key things.
And do you think there's a real or a perceived threat of the current global political situation on a lot of the great work that's gone on over the past few decades in building that capacity?
Well, I think there is, in the sense that, of course, we're in a very strange situation, and the pulling of funds. But I mean, obviously, particularly with US funding and with USAID and other US funding, but also a general reduction in funding for many other countries as well, is a threat. And I think one's got to look at this at a different time scale. I mean, right now, it's a massive problem. It's particularly a problem, obviously, for delivery. Is that sort of the reduction of funding for HIV programs is really just a disaster. It's having a massive effect in research as well, particularly on African universities. UCT in Cape Town has lost a very large proportion of its total research funding, and that's the truth. The same is true of many other African universities. So there's an immediate big issue. One thing you can say about it, though, is that I don't know how widely this is felt, but certainly in people I talk to across the continent, there is a real sort of sense of, well, this is a turning point at which we can't just accept this, but things have to change. There's got to be a different way of funding in the long term. Now, it's easy to say that and it's hard to do, but I do see a very kind of strong determination to sort of move away from dependence on that kind of funding. As I say, that will be hard to do, and in the short term, there's massive problems with it. But I'm happy that it's not just a passive sort of, oh, well, this is a disaster. Far more, it's discussions now about, okay, so things need to change. We've got to work with governments, we've got to work with private individuals, we've got to work with generating local funding. And I think in the long term, that could be very positive. The problem is the gap between now and then, and there's a lot of pain in that gap.
I guess short term, yes, this is a challenging climate and landscape, but through all of the capacity building that you've contributed to, that others have contributed to, that low middle income countries, in particular the sub-Saharan region, may well be better placed to face those medium long-term challenges.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think the thing that is so striking is just the enormous capacity and potential building up now across African research landscape. This is reflected in things like when we put out a call, whether it's from Science for Africa Foundation or from other groupings I'm involved with, when we put out calls for funding and proposals and such like, the number and quality of proposals now coming in from across the continent is sort of going up and up and up all the time, which why wouldn't it? But it does reflect, the amount of development there's been over the years gone by. So I'm actually very optimistic about the potential across the continent, and I think when everyone's working really hard and thinking about this, there's going to be no easy answers to how you bring in additional funding. But I think now at least there is a kind of fantastic energy in the whole ecosystem. So I am optimistic, but not kind of not in a blasé way. There's a lot of work to do, but I think it is an optimistic view. Yeah.
And in addition to political challenges, we have other issues to deal with, and not least things like climate change, which of course is having a major impact on the population migration, but also the shifting geography of disease, which would include things like vector-borne threats like malaria, emerging viruses. What do you think the research community should be doing now, not only to anticipate, but also to adapt to these changes?
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways, one of the problems about the whole, if you like, climate aspect of this is because it's so all enveloping, it's an existential thing. It's actually quite hard to kind of get down to the detail of it. What I mean by this is, there are a lot of calls on climate and health, climate and this and climate and that, but it isn't as if climate sciences is a single thing. Climate sciences spans everything from kind of, agriculture, meteorology, battery technology. And because it's so all embracing and all encompassing, it is actually quite hard, I think, sometimes to think, well, what do we do? Because it's everything, it's everywhere. So in that sense, it's a background against which we all now work and live. And I think obviously what it does call for more than ever, I mean, it's always been true that interdisciplinary research is important, but I think, increasingly the challenges we're facing are so complex and so interrelated, between health, climate, agriculture, as you say, migration, demographic changes, that what it really does emphasize is the need to build very strong interdisciplinary approaches to these challenges.
And do you think to some extent that the regions which have more wealth, places like Europe, the US, do you think to some extent this increased threat is really making them sit up and take this issue seriously? Or do you think we still are very much in the position of it's somebody else's problem?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's going to vary, isn't it? There will be individuals and organizations who are taking things seriously. One thing that quite strikes me is when I listen to colleagues in the UK who are involved with epidemic preparedness and such like, I do get a sense that many people feel we've failed to learn a lot of the lessons from the pandemic, that we're not as prepared as we should be, that there are still major gaps. I'm not really in a position to judge that because it's not where I work, as it were. But what does strike me is the experience of having gone through that pandemic. And again, I don't want to generalize because Africa is a big place, so I can only talk about the place where I had experience. So is that in fact the response was fast and alert, as it were. And in some ways, this perhaps represents when you're starting without too many complicated kind of existing infrastructures, things had to respond very quickly. So in some ways, I do think there's more thought going on across the continent about preparedness than perhaps there is in the UK. But as I say, I may not be the best person to judge the UK scene, but I do think across the continent there's a real increased awareness and importance of epidemic and preparedness.
And returning to one of your areas of focus and interest, we've heard some really exciting news over the past year or so in the fight against malaria, and in particular, what looked on the face of it to be pretty effective vaccines coming to the fore. What do you see as the future for malaria? Are these going to be the magic bullet, or do you think there's still going to be additional efforts and additional approaches needed?
Yeah, I think both. By which I mean, one thing that often strikes me, and I often say, when we're in these kind of environments talking about malaria, is that the focus is often, and it's not just malaria, but the focus often is on, as you say, magic bullets. And whereas in many ways, the biggest thing, not just with malaria, but with many health challenges, is health systems. So, if you look around the world, no one has ever eliminated malaria from a country without having a reasonably well-developed and reasonably equitable health system. And the the cor- co- no, the opposite for that, or the corollary, if you like, is that it will be impossible, whatever magic bullets we have, to really uh, get on top of malaria without a good health system. So in some ways, it's not magic bullets, it is health system and universal coverage and things which are important. Having said that, obviously the technical tools are critical. And I do think, I'm biased here because I worked very much around malaria vaccine for most of my career. And although when I went into the field, everyone was saying there'll be a vaccine in 5 years, and that was sort of 35 years ago. I am actually now more optimistic than I've ever been about the potential for malaria vaccines, because the vaccines we have, um, and they're out there now, are incredibly promising. But I think more importantly, I think it's clear that there will be better vaccines, and they're in the pipeline right now. So I do think that we are looking to a future where vaccines will have a really important place in controlling malaria, but only if we also sort of deal with the health systems issues.
And I guess something else to throw into that interest within LSTM is where does vector control fit in here? Do you still think that is an incredibly important facet to the overall control and
Yeah.
bringing about the end of malaria?
Oh, for sure. I mean, malaria is a classic vector-borne disease, and as you know, much of the history of thinking about malaria, if you like, the theoretical thinking about it and the modelling, was based very much on the vector side of things. And I think the other thing about malaria, which we often again talk about, is that malaria isn't a single disease. It's many, many, many different diseases in many different ecologies, and those ecologies are often determined by um, the things affecting vectors. So no, there's no doubt that attacking the vector has always been and will continue to be a really important part of malaria control. So when I say I'm optimistic about vaccines, I don't mean I think therefore we'll be able to stop everything else. I think the whole point about malaria is it's such a protean set of conditions, if you like, environmental conditions, social conditions, that you need all tools. So I think vector control and new approaches to vector control are going to be incredibly important as well.
And just to move the focus slightly, we're clearly the work intersects around various infectious disease threats, and LSTM has work ongoing from things like malaria, but through to emerging viruses, for example, like Ebola virus, coronaviruses. What insights do you think you've drawn about how we should be best prepared for future outbreaks? And how do we go about improving the real-time response? And also, how do we build that necessary capacity, whether it's in surveillance, diagnostics, treatments, vaccines, whatever it might be?
Well, I think there needs to be a really concentrated and focused attempt to bring together all the different. We were talking earlier about interdisciplinary studies in relation to kind of complex issues, and the whole issue of epidemics, pandemics, its interaction with climate and such like is a classical complex issue. So I think there needs to be the very deliberate building up of all the capacities required to do that. And again, I'm fairly optimistic. I mean, you probably know that recently the Science for Africa Foundation, in partnership with Oxford Pandemic Science Institute and in funding partnership with the MasterCard Foundation, have announced a whole set of new large-scale programs called the Epsilon programs, 7 of them across Africa, which the aim is to build up this sort of interdisciplinary capacity across all the different areas of science and policy which are required to work on epidemic preparedness. So I think that's a really optimistic and promising thing. That, I mean, it's just starting now, so they're launching this year, but I think it's going to be really powerful.
And do you think we are better prepared now than we were before the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic? Because I personally am not so convinced either nationally or, more importantly, globally. But I wonder what your perspective is.
I think I mean, it's more your area than mine. So if you're not convinced, it'd be easy. I'm not going to say I am. No, I agree with you. We were saying earlier that it does strike me that colleagues in the UK certainly feel that, that if you like, the UK and industrialized economies have not necessarily learned from how they, as well as they might have done. I do think there's a kind of more of a focus on this across at least parts of Africa that I'm sort of working with or interacting with a lot. So, and I think one of the things that not so much, well, it was from SARS-CoV-2, but going back to Ebola, the difference between the two things for me, and this may be rather superficial and it may not be a totally fair comment, but the big difference I feel was that in SARS-CoV-2, the fact that African ministries of health and research institutes, to a very large degree, had to work on their own, or at least when they were supported, it was often at a distance, as opposed to the experience in the early Ebola epidemics, where, the place was flooded out, as it were, with what really well-intentioned. It's not a criticism of collaboration, but to some degree, there was a problem of the whole decision making being taken over from externally, whereas in SARS-CoV-2, because of all the travel restrictions, that just wasn't possible. And certainly my interactions with from at that time from the African Academy of Sciences, with Africa CDC and WHO Africa, was that it really pulled together a very strong, on the ground and quite flexible response because people had to do it. So I think that's one of the things that to me came out of it as a positive.
It's interesting to that strengthening of capacity and that self-sufficiency and that independence is clearly something that African nations are really striving towards and investing heavily in, and it is a significant change in that landscape. How important do you think LSTM's role is within that activity, and how can we as researchers, scientists, clinicians best contribute to that?
Yeah, I think LSTM has a really important role, and I'm not saying that because this is an LSTM podcaster and I'm an alumnus. I genuinely think it does, as do the other sort of, if you like, the long-established centres, Liverpool, London, and now I'm based at Oxford, and we're also thinking hard about this. I think the role is one of sort of engaging in genuinely equitable partnership and being available, as it were, and getting used to a different way of working. Whereas in the past, the agendas might have been set from northern institutions. Now, I think it's much more a matter of working with colleagues to define and co-create the agendas, and even being prepared to be a little bit modest, as it were, in the sense of not expecting everything to be led. And I think Liverpool's been good at this. I think other institutions, also are beginning to move in that direction. It's making available the enormous depth of expertise which inevitably resides in any institution which has been working on something for 100 years or more, but not assuming that it's going to be the same role that we've always played. So I think that's the challenge for Liverpool and for everybody else. But I think talking to colleagues across those institutions and colleagues across the continent, I think everyone's agreed that that's the direction we're all moving in.
And you reminded us then that you are, in fact, an LSTM alum. Can you remember what your experiences were like as a student? And I won't say when it was.
It was 1981, I think. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was a fantastic time. I mean, it was very exciting. As we mentioned earlier about deciding to go into what was then called tropical medicine, now I guess we'd say global health. The fact that Liverpool was right there on the doorstep, I trained in medicine in Liverpool, was a fantastic opportunity. And it was incredibly exciting. It was an introduction to a completely new world, both in terms of the sheer interest of what was being taught, but more importantly, actually, the experience of being together with a kind of really international group of students. I mean, it was an immersive experience. And I think everybody who's been through that looks back very fondly to whatever their year was that they were doing the DTM&H. But it was a life-shaping experience, but not just because of the intellectual content, but really because you met so many kind of interesting people from all over the world.
Thanks, Kevin. Where's it going? It's good to meet you.
Very good. Good to meet you too. And no doubt see you at some point when I'm up in the pool.
I hope so.